in leadership, always respecting the competition, always knowing that they can come back to bite you, is a very important component. But if you think they're going to lie down, you lose the upper hand in negotiations and in tactics as well. So I think Donald Trump has to take a leaf from learning to respect the competition a great deal.
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father and son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. We took a bit of a break over the Chinese New Year holiday. Do you want to tell us how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm on the road to recovery.
Yeah. What happened to you?
I had an inguinal hernia operation. It's quite a big cut. So they had to do it. What happened is the intestine got trapped inside the inner lining of my stomach wall. And because it was stuck, everything that I consume, I cannot pass motion. And therefore, they were stuck there. And it was very uncomfortable 2 days. And I was chairing 2 full days of a Sunway board meeting in pain. I was hoping it might go away. But that evening when I came home and I had the whole night, I couldn't sleep even a minute. And so at 3 o'clock, I had a few bouts of vomiting. And your mom insisted early in the morning that I have to admit myself to hospital. So they did a quick MRI, checked the biopsy, straight away under the knife for a full surgery. And I was there for 2 nights.
You might also want to share how it happened. It's quite a curious case.
I think it must have happened over a long period of time, but the actual trigger was funny. A very violent sneeze. Not just one, a couple of sneezes. Yeah. I have this problem early in the morning when I start sneezing. It's almost uncontrollable and unstoppable.
And so you sneezed and then you had that continuous bout of sneezing. And then after the last sneeze, you said you had some sort of sharp pain. Abdominal pain, which you then tahan or that I was hoping it might just go away
under
the rug for I think 4 days, right? 4 days you were dealing with that.
4 days, and of the 4 days, 2 days I was chairing 2 full days of Sunway board meetings in pain. In fact, on the last day, unknown to everybody else, because I was wearing a jacket, my stomach had bloated so big that I had to unzip my pants under the jacket because I couldn't hold it anymore because there's so much air inside there and food that we were taking. It was so uncomfortable.
So hospitalized by a sneeze.
Yeah.
Who would have thought? But glad that you're doing a lot better. We obviously took a break to allow you to recover. But today, it's post-CNY. I thought it would be a good time to talk about loss. Now, we were just quipping earlier before we started recording that, during the CNY period, Chinese New Year period, if you have gambled over the Chinese New Year period and maybe you have taken some losses, this would be a good time to talk about loss because jokes aside, if we look at what's been happening in recent weeks, DeepSeek, has had a huge effect on the US tech scene, but as well as not just the US stock market, but the global stock market as well. So I thought it would be good to talk about loss, not necessarily just focusing on that kind of monetary loss, but, as leaders, as organizations, how do we first prevent ourselves from failing or from losing out to maybe a competitor? But then what are some of the disciplines then that we can apply to ourselves to ensure that we have this kind of posture of continuous learning, which we talk about on the podcast quite a bit. But then after that, I think going into then, if you are at a loss in whatever shape or form, how do you handle it? And then ultimately, how do you bounce back from it? So maybe we can start with defining, how do we define loss?
Loss is an inevitable part of human life, Leon, and I think it's intricately woven in the whole fabric of human experience. It manifests itself in, I could call it the 7 cardinal losses. The first one being loss of loved ones. It's a very big loss. And the second one is financial losses. The third one is defeat in sports or competition or even election. Those are very big losses. The fourth is failure in careers such as a loss of a job. The fifth is to do with loss of freedom through imprisonment. And the sixth is societal losses, like those incurred and suffered during war. And the seventh one is spiritual losses of fellowship with God through sin. Those are the seven cardinal losses. These are very grave losses that you got to go through. And we can talk about them as exactly as you said. The way we perceive and respond to those losses determines how we grow resilient and remain trapped in despair. And so in leadership parlance, it is very important for us to think about how we might exercise leadership when we are caught in those losses and how we recover and navigate ourselves out from them.
Yeah. Let's talk about, I think you mentioned the last one about kind of loss in terms of maybe a sense of spiritual or moral compass or sense of self. I know you put that as the last one, but I maybe want to start on that lens.
Yeah,
because,
sure.
I believe that.
You're a pastor after all.
Yeah, exactly. But even if you don't look at it through a spiritual lens, I think a loss of a sense of self, whether it is informed by your spiritual beliefs or whether or just on a secular basis, you are just talking about identity. I think that's quite important. It's an important one to ensure that we don't lose sight of, because I think if you have a clear sense of self, so as Christians, then we believe that our identity is formed or anchored in Christ. But even if you don't, if you're not religious, then surely having a real sense of self-belief that forms your basis or your compass, if you like. So, maybe let's talk about the first point, which is about complacency. And let's begin through this lens. How do we not become complacent or overly comfortable? Starting with maybe this sense of self. In your case, you mentioned spiritual health.
Spiritual. Yeah, in the Bible, let's talk about David, for example. David had got everything. God blessed him with wealth. God blessed him with popularities. He got the people's support. People loved him. So there were many times in that period that David had become complacent. And so he assumed that God was going to continue to grant him everything that he wanted, everything that he desired, that it were all at his feet because God was blessing with everything. Then, of course, he sinned. That the complacency led him to thinking that he could have anything that under the sun he could have. He even murdered people. He even stole someone's wives. He did so many despicable things as Christians. Therefore, he lost his identity in fellowship with God. Once you lose your identity in fellowship with God, and everything will start to spiral downwards. But of course, he bounced back because David, the story goes as in the Bible, every time he sinned, he came and asked God for forgiveness. That's why God, he said, you are a man after my own heart. And he's always sought God's forgiveness, returned back to his true north, reconciled with God through forgiveness, and repented from his sin. That's how he rebounded back. But the key here was, the first one was to acknowledge that he had sinned. And therefore, when you acknowledge you have sinned, then you then ask for forgiveness. That's the beginning of reconciliation. That's how you reconcile. You set up your fellowship with God properly, then you can get back into fellowship with God. And that's, I think, the general trend. The whole Old Testament is littered with examples of people that have transgressed and sinned. And that this, what you call it the loss of fellowship and the loss of identity by being children of God, because they have, through sin, they have departed from that relationship.
Yeah. I mean, let's now talk about it from a leadership or business standpoint then. You mentioned earlier in the David example, you mentioned how even if he had messed up, he returned to God in a posture of repentance. Now, even if you don't look at it through a spiritual lens, actually what that points to is there's an element of accountability. So I think in the same way, as we lead teams, then I think one way to do that, or to ensure that we do not become complacent, is by having constant sort of communion with those around us, trusted advisors, or even members of your team as well, so that you're keeping that communication going and seeking out feedback, essentially. So what does that look like for you in your kind of corporate journey? whether at MAS, whether at Shell, or even PEMANDU currently. What are some maybe practices you have put in place to ensure that you do not become complacent?
The thing is this, every year you must get the team to come down and have a huddle through an away day, really going to reflect on last year's performance. Then you will recognize that if there are some losses that you incurred here and there, weaknesses in the system, the reflection is the period when you start looking back. When you start looking back, you identify some of the signs and weaknesses that are appearing through the organization in business, the way you run it. Then you identify the things that you need to do to act in the course of the new year to deal with them. So life, every opportunity in terms of a loss is an opportunity to learn and to rebound. So the very important act to make sure you don't fall into the trap is to do a reflection. An annual reflection. Everyone in the team really look at the organization, the business performance, and the signs within the organization of a decay or even complacency. Then you put in place the measures that will help you to make sure that the organization does not spiral downward into those. And that's how you prevent it. That annual exercise is very important. In the time I was having a sabbatical, you guys went for that away day. Was it in Phuket or Langkawi?
It was in Langkawi.
In Langkawi. It was an opportunity for reflection and looking back and looking forward. So looking back and looking forward, those are very important exercises of leadership.
Let's talk about now continuous learning.
Yeah.
This is something that you talk a lot about in the podcast. Why is an attitude or a posture of continuous learning important when leading teams or when leading yourself?
When the word I want to underline the word continuous learning. A lot of people ask me this. Yeah, but how do you do continuous learning? For me, it's quite simple. I remember in one of our episodes, I talk about creating a 3-feet plan. That means a plan that you know on a weekly basis who in the organization is going to do what, when, and how they're going to do it in the plan. Very detailed. And so because you do that, you have a monitoring system. The M, monitor it continuously. Every Friday, you must have a dashboard to know what had been delivered and what has not been delivered and what's been partially delivered. And then you go into the third, which is solving problem recursively, the S. Now that is continuous learning. Every week, you need to install in a mechanism in a system where the organization look at last week's performance, look at the mistakes being made, look at the losses that were incurred, and then the following week get into solving problem. That's where you have continuous learning. And if you don't have this rigor of a discipline, we call it do it relentlessly, monitor it continuously, and solve problem recursively, then you are taking out the opportunity for continuous learning. And the continuous learning is about that discipline.
Yeah.
And I'm totally convinced that while in the beginning I talk about the annual exercise where you step back and look at the whole year, but this is a weekly routine exercise of doing it so that during the year, week after week in and week out, you are continuously learning as an organization.
Yeah.
That is how you prevent it from being collapsed. Because you can't wait until the end of the year when everything had collapsed. Then you say, well, now we're going to Langkawi.
Yeah.
Let's figure it out. But things have already collapsed. But if you have a weekly approach to dealing with this, you wouldn't have that calamity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, the key thing there is the fact that all those words, they imply an element of repetition.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a good frame to have because that supposes that we as an organization, as a team, or even if you are just talking about managing yourself, I think usually the hardest person to manage is yourself. That supposes that failure is not a big thing that happens further down the line, but that already supposes that in our day-to-day, we're probably going to experience micro failures.
Absolutely.
And I think when we have that framing, then that allows us to identify or actively identify those kind of smaller micro failures to then think of, okay, what are ways that we can address these smaller things? Because I think if we have a practice of addressing the smaller failures and doing that on a very regular cadence, whether it's daily or weekly, then we're less likely to get get to the point where we then face the colossal failure later on. I think the problem with many organizations, even when it comes to personal downfalls in character, that usually comes because we brush the micro failures aside in thinking those don't need to be addressed. We don't need to do, relentlessly. We don't need to monitor continuously. We don't need to solve problems recursively. If we don't have that discipline, then it's very easy for those things to then start to eventually grow.
Yeah.
And then before you know it, you're at the point where it's too late already.
Yeah.
And
I do
the
know
damage
that
is irreparable.
I do know that a lot of people, they do monitoring. They have a dashboard, but they do not get into problem solving. That is when it makes the mistake is they're just happy that they have a dashboard and they're just looking at it, but nobody is taking an effort to go and deal with it. The problem also is that the bosses ask the question, what are you doing with this? You know what happened? The guys are going to tell the bosses, they lie through their teeth and say, problem is already solved.
Yeah.
But the problem is there. So when you do the monitoring, you don't only monitor activities being done, you also monitor results that are achieved.
Yes.
So the question to that person is that if you say there are no problems, but the results not accrued, something's wrong. And so therefore, the question always is, if the results not achieved and there are no problems, guarantee the person is not telling the truth.
Yeah.
And so there must be a system in the organization that confronts both of the results as well as the ability to act on the actions that are in the monitoring
exactly.
dashboard.
And I think the language that we put around it is important as well.
Yeah.
So, we call it very intentionally, we call it problem-solving meetings. In the
absolutely.
past, our old kind of comms team within PEMANDU, we used to have a weekly WIP or work in progress meeting. But we said, let's not call it that anymore, because when you call it a work in progress meeting, that language now implies, or it kind of leads people to think, okay, I'm going to approach this meeting and give an update.
Yeah.
But actually, most updates, I would say probably 90% of updates can be done asynchronously, either through email or even WhatsApp. But by changing it and calling it a problem-solving meeting, it changed the game, because it meant that people came with problems, and now this meeting becomes fruitful because people are getting involved to try to solve the problem. And it also takes away, I think, when we have a habit of solving problems recursively, it takes away maybe the dauntingness of the task of problem solving. Usually why people feel that it's tiring to solve problems is because we probably wait too long until the problem is actually a sizable problem. Then obviously that becomes very time consuming, and people will say, we don't have so much time because there's a lot of things going on. We don't have time to solve these problems. But when you have this weekly discipline of the recursive problem solving, smaller bite-sized problems, you actually spend less time, because the problems are small enough that they can usually be resolved within that one meeting, and it won't require a long concerted effort. So I think that's good. Let's talk about now indicators of growth. We talked about not being comfortable. We talked about continuous learning. I've found that there's a lot of talk of imposter syndrome, and I certainly, I think, am someone who experiences this quite a lot. I've experienced this in the past as I prepare to step into a new role at the church as well. It's something that I'm definitely feeling now. But I've been wondering, is it necessarily a bad thing to experience imposter syndrome? I think on one hand you can say, of course, yes, it is, because if the imposter syndrome purely stems from a position of almost a selfish posture of not wanting to look bad in front of others, then obviously that's not so healthy. But on the other hand, I think sometimes a degree of imposter syndrome can be healthy, because why do we feel imposter syndrome? We usually feel imposter syndrome if we're in a situation or position where we are not necessarily the smartest person in the room. Maybe you're doing something new. And that to me is actually the litmus test for me personally of being in a season of growth. Because if I'm not experiencing imposter syndrome, that means that I'm very comfortable. And that probably means that I'm likely to end up on a path towards complacency, because I don't feel I need to put in effort But obviously, if you feel imposter syndrome, it means that probably those around you in the room are better than you at the things that you're doing. But isn't that a good thing? To be surrounded by people who are smarter than you. I mean, people say you are the sum of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And so I usually find that imposter syndrome for me has often been a positive indicator
sure.
of whether there's an adequate amount of stretch. The caveat here is that it can't merely be wanting to address it to make yourself look good. It has to then have a fruitful outcome of saying, okay, I identify that I feel this kind of imposter syndrome. I recognize where it is useful because I recognize that it is helping me realize I'm in a season of growth and this is positive. Then obviously the other part of it, the negative part of it, of the insecurity, all of that is stuff that you have to deal with separately and learn how to compartmentalize. How do you deal with discomfort?
In 2014, I met Carl Lewis in Kuala Lumpur, and he talked about his own experience in what you call imposter syndrome. He made a declaration, and it was published in the Newsweek, that he was the next Jesse Owen. And so clearly he already was acting his way into a new way of being by declaring that he was going to be the next Jesse Owen. Of course, people poo-pooed him. Now, the question today is that if Jesse Owen had declared that was what he was going to become, and he didn't act on it, and he just kept on declaring it, he didn't do the exercise, he didn't go through the routine of checking his nutrition, he didn't do everything that's needed to achieve it, then he's clearly going to drift and spiral downwards to become an imposter. But if he did all act on the things that's needed to make him champion, then he would. And that's exactly what he did. So to your point, when you declare who you want to become, the act of transformation itself, it's on the edge of one side of the coin. You are declaring to become an imposter, but on the other edge, you're dreaming to become a transformed person, to be who you want to become. That's why the statement to say that you act your way into a new way of thinking or into a new way of being, that is when you act it, that's when you cease to become an imposter. You will become an imposter when you declare it, but you don't act on it. And you don't take the action, then you become an imposter. You're fake, you're unauthentic. You're declaring people who you are when you are not. That you're a con man. And so it was clear in the story, in the example of Carl Lewis, when he declared he was going to be the next Jesse Owen, it was published on the front page of the Newsweek, that he had no choice, that he had to act on it because it was clearly laid out there. That meant he needed to win 100 meters, the long jump, and the 200 meters. And those were tough disciplines for him to do. And he did them. All of them, by the way.
We've talked about preventative measures.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about actual losses.
Yeah.
And maybe to start, what have been some of your biggest losses you feel? And it can be personal, it could be work-related. What have been your biggest losses?
I would say one of the biggest losses was when my dad passed on. It was the first time I lost a parent. It was the second time when mom died. But it was the first time that I did. It was difficult because Tama, my dad, was behaving rather normally. And he realized that there were certain motor skills that he could not cope anymore with. For example, he used to play the sapek, which is a Sarawakian musical instrument. Suddenly he realized that he just could not play it. And what was happening was, after we did a diagnosis and they said he had Alzheimer's, it was a very big loss. But the key thing to take away from that was, my dad was a guy that was able to acknowledge and did not deny that he had that problem. And the first action that he took was, he agreed that he would resign from his post of being the headman of the village as a Pamancha and Penghulu. It was a very courageous thing for him to do. He was still able and still cogent, and he could still do his job, but he knew that he was on the downward spiral because of the Alzheimer's. So he took that. And the second thing he did was, he gathered all his friends, relatives to a party in Miri, And he told everybody in his speech that he had this disease. He will die twice, he said. First, he will die mentally because his ability to remember and to think will be lost, and eventually he will die physically. And then at the time he said, look, perhaps many of you know that few years down the road when you come and see me, I wouldn't even remember your name. So why don't we do it today, that tonight, if you have nice things that you want to say to me that you would say at my grave, why don't we say it tonight? It was one of the most emotional parties that I've ever encountered. 400 people in a room singing Amazing Grace in tears. And it was a very big loss.
Yeah, and to make sure he had all grounds covered, we then did a second round here in KL.
In KL too.
For those who couldn't make it there.
I mean, it was a very incredible man. So it was a loss. For me, I grieved at the loss of my dad. But we had a lot of time to grieve because it took 6 years prior to his actual demise, his passing. And that was a period of grief. Time heals. If we were lucky in many sense, but it was very painful to watch how a grown man that was capable in so many things that he did, that it was just slowly going downhill, both mentally and physically. But he did something quite incredible. He told me and my siblings they was going to read the Bible and pray to God every day until he lost the ability to pray and to read. And that's what he did. And every prayer, he was telling God he's ready to go. He's done everything that he needed to do up to the age of 90. And he done it all. He was ready to go and go to heaven and be with God in fellowship. So it was quite an incredible. It was his strength that gave me the strength to grieve, to deal with my own loss.
And that was good. I think because we had this kind of longer gestation period with him, I think from the time that he was diagnosed to when he finally passed, if I'm not mistaken, was probably about 7 years.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a 7-year.
6+ years. And he was in bed in the final year.
So it's very long. But because it wasn't kind of just a passive loss, but rather he took active steps to say, how do we celebrate more intentionally while I'm still present mentally, but also then that kind of daily Bible reading discipline. I think that also gave maybe the rest of the family an assurance, not just that we were able to kind of say the nice things we wanted to say while he was still around, but also that he as a person, and this goes back to that sense of self, that his sense of self, we say all is well with my soul. Right. And I think because we had assurance that that was the case with him, it meant that at his passing, I remember it was very funny because it wasn't, of course it was sad, but at the same time, it was also kind of a joyful time, because I remember even on the evening that he passed, we then had dinner. We even sang songs. We sang songs while he was on his deathbed as well. In fact, I just watched a video of it the other day. We were singing, Christian songs around him. And I remember 2 days after the funeral, we even had a party as a family.
And that's what he
wanted. We went to this place called Bistro 21. Anyone from Kuching, Bistro 21 is a favorite of all the uncles, and even now my generation as well for nostalgic purposes. I remember we went there. We had a great night, singing songs, joining. We hijacked the house band over there. So, and then we were able to do that because we knew that all was well with him, and that ultimately he lived a good life, and that he also took proactive measures. And I think he handled loss well.
Yeah, he did. He really did.
It also brings me to the point of sometimes I think there are some losses that are necessary. So obviously, I will not to say that his Alzheimer's was necessary, but upon realizing that, getting that diagnosis, he then took the active measure to take, you could argue, take a loss in terms of stepping down from his position. That was acknowledging and taking an active loss.
Not denying it, actually very, very important.
Yeah. So as much as we talk about prevention, I think sometimes there's also a time and place for knowing when the music has stopped, and when it is time to maybe move on, accept accept defeat or accept the loss or hand over to someone else. Maybe how has maybe that kind of accepting of a loss played out in your life in work context?
In my own life, I mean, I hadn't quite reached a level where I've really, really accepted defeat. The closest I've done that was the pandemic. Because I realized that PEMANDU, we had no cash at that time. We were only going to last for a couple of months, and then we were going to run out of cash. And, all our contracts were suspended or canceled. We had no clients. And it was really, really difficult because the pandemic was uncontrollable. There's no way I could handle that. All other losses up to that, in Malaysia Alliance, Shell MDS, there were Shell Sri Lanka, there were companies that I was CEOs, I was managing director, we were losing money, but there were many things I could handle. But this was a whole world collapse right in front of my face. And at that time, I went through a very difficult time dealing with how to deal with this. So I kind of said, this was an uncontrollable event. And because it was uncontrollable, I'll do the one thing that was unprecedented, that I've never done before. I didn't want to decide what to do personally with a company. That's why I did the unprecedented act. That means getting everybody to vote.
Yeah.
And I got every staff in PEMANDU to vote what to do with the company. 1, close down the company. 2, mothball the company. That means close it and reopen it 2 years down the road after the pandemic has subsided. And option number three is to reconfigure it big time. Cut down half of the staff. I go on 100% salary cut for the whole 2-year period. My partners were 70% pay cut and 30 to 50 and 10% for the junior staff. And I asked everybody to vote. 1 person, 1 vote. The majority voted for number 3. That was, to me, was a leadership action that was unprecedented. I've never done that in my entire corporate life. Yeah. And that was simply because I realized this time around I was facing a problem that was completely beyond me. The pandemic was there. We were just caught with the pandemic. I kind of say that I accepted defeat, that I didn't want to make a decision because I accepted defeat and I wanted the collective group to make the decision. I think it was the best decision we made. And we recovered completely from it, actually.
Reminds me a bit of what we had Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar on our last episode. And he talked about this 5-minute rule. And I think it kind of, that what you just described speaks into that a little bit. Yeah. This idea of accepting maybe even...
You're 5 minutes away from resignation.
Yeah, being 5 minutes away from resignation. But what that essentially means is not being afraid of failure. And coming to terms with it. Like, so in your case, you were able to, what you said was, okay, I've come to terms with the fact that this company might actually have to shut down completely.
Yeah.
But because of that then put you in a position to say, but rather than making a decision to shut it down, I'm going to put it up for a vote. So you relinquished control and then you left it up to a vote for the staff to vote. In the end, there was an overwhelming majority that voted for us to continue running, but to reconfigure the company. And so, while that was a loss, if you like, in terms of relinquishing control, the end outcome of it was, I think, was a big success.
Big success.
Because, a couple of years down the line, then we were talking about the SSM data from 2023, which pegged PEMANDU Associates as the second most profitable consulting firm in Malaysia.
Yeah.
So sometimes actually being able to take certain losses like that, whether it's relinquishing control, take smaller losses, not be afraid of the ultimate failure. Those are actually things that can help us to eventually, potentially come out on the winning side of things. And this was clearly demonstrated in PEMANDU Associates. We referenced OpenAI and DeepSeek earlier. Now, DeepSeek has had a huge effect on the US tech scene. And I think, obviously we can talk about some of the comparisons between OpenAI and the likes of DeepSeek. OpenAI, I think we talked about Complacency earlier. OpenAI and ChatGPT was functioning almost like a monopoly. A monopoly in the AI, in the generative AI space. Now with the emergence of DeepSeek, it's a huge game changer. I mean, first of all, for businesses, it's kind of a no-brainer to go with something like a model like DeepSeek, which is a fraction of the cost.
Yeah, the one thing that you can do to prevent yourself from spiraling into a loss to a competitor is to make sure that you never underestimate the competition. And if you always must respect the competition, the day you begin to underestimate the competition, then you are going to run a spiral down into complacency. So in this case, Sam Altman and the team in OpenAI, they have to really now respect the competition. How do you respect the competition? You must always believe there's some guy out there is going to study your system. Some guy out there going to look at the entire algorithm. Some guy who go out there not having looked at the algorithm, design something even better that can train it even cheaper and quicker and to become smarter. And that is the key, because the Chinese, if you just Google it, they form a team of relatively young people, and you can Google it, you know the names of the people. There are a handful of less than 20 people in that team. They really did that.
Yeah.
They studied the OpenAI. They've really figured out a way how to do it cheaper and quicker. So,
and not only that, cheaper and quicker, but it's also, I mean, the irony is that OpenAI is called OpenAI.
Yeah.
But DeepSeek is actually open source, while OpenAI isn't.
Absolutely.
So again, that's a huge advantage as well for DeepSeek.
Just take a look at the numbers. It takes about $100 million to train a system under OpenAI. Under DeepSeek, it takes about 6 million.
Exactly.
So the difference with 6 million to 100 million is a massive, savings. So because of that, it can then become much, much cheaper. It will not cost a lot of people to access it. And this is what the Chinese are doing. So I think the key here is to must always respect competition. Always expect some guy out there is going to figure me out. And because they figure me out, I now have to have safeguards in my system and continuously learn how to break down your cost, bring it down lower and lower, and make it much more efficient. So I think, of course, it's still out there, still early days for DeepSeek. The noise is very big. So in the stock market, the noise is very big.
Yeah.
When the noise is very big, the sentiments overwhelm the fundamentals.
Correct.
And today, of course, the numbers of people that use DeepSeek has not reached a level that it should reflect itself in the plummeting of the share price for OpenAI, the ChatGPT,
and not just for OpenAI and ChatGPT, but with like NVIDIA,
they're all getting a hit as well, because
massive hit,
they are
which has then had a
to
ripple effect on our stock market here as well.
Absolutely. So I think sentiments, when people begin to see what is available out there, and people said, well, the stock market is a thing that will move based on speed. If you're late in the game, you don't make money in the stock market. You have to be quick in the game. So that means, what do? Speculate. Early speculation, if you do it right, that's how you then make money. People quit and then put money in other areas, and that's how they pocket it. That's how the share price for NVIDIA and all the OpenAI stocks associated with that started coming down. Actually.
Yeah. I do believe it's still early days. I think there's still a lot of opportunity now for Sam Altman and the team to recognize the strength coming from DeepSeek and potentially other AI models that will come out of China as well, and then to be able to pivot in response to that. Which makes me think of then companies like Tesla. I think Tesla potentially is getting quite close to the edge, because not only are they having to now battle the likes of BYD, but you have so many other Chinese players now. So that, coupled with the fact that if you look at, I've often wondered now with Elon Musk being involved in so many other things, including his new appointment within Trump's government, Trump's administration, is he perhaps holding on to the role of CEO of Tesla for a bit too long? Should he maybe consider handing it over to someone else? Just given the fact that Tesla, there's just so much more competition.
In the year 2008, Elon Musk nearly went bankrupt with Tesla and SpaceX. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. the man had learned from it. He learned from that. So what did he do? He really camped himself in the factory really for Tesla. He put a bed there and he slept there, and he was just continuously working with the team to look at every part of Tesla to figure it out. So focus.
Yes.
So he knew the way out from his rut, for his bankruptcy, was to focus on it.
Exactly.
He doubled down. He put all the money that he had accumulated and threw them into this. He went for broke.
Exactly.
Now, he was focused. Very clear he was focused. At that
So
time,
a brilliant mind
Yeah.
coupled with focus,
focus.
recipe for success.
Now
Now
he's
a
gone
brilliant
there.
mind,
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know, just observing from afar, maybe getting a little bit lost in the trappings of
Yeah.
influence. Also, now with a lack of focus, what does that potentially lead to?
Yeah. So he needs to remind himself the way he got out from his rut was that precise thing that you did before. But he's now being tempted to walk a different path. But life is about transformation. But if he wants to transform himself into a man that made a huge difference in the administration of the government, and which is what he's trying to do, is his government efficiency department. If he's going to do it, I think he has to relinquish his role in dealing with Tesla, because the Chinese are at the heels. But you know what he's done? Because he knew that. Give credit to Elon Musk. He opened collaboration with the Chinese. He put up a factory in China.
In China, yeah.
And you notice in the beginning part, when Elon Musk talked about the Chinese, he poo-pooed them in the early part. But he realized that with the way that the Chinese putting up the electric cars and the innovations they're putting in, then he put tremendous respect on the Chinese. So, in the administration, from what I know and what I understand, he is not quite in agreement with Trump with regards to creating a wall against China, although the word was very much like that. Notice when he said he was going to introduce a tariff, he introduced 20% tariff for Canada, 20%, 25% for Mexico. But after all the bravado and talk, he only imposed a 10% on China. Because he realized, I think through folks like Elon Musk, they're telling him, don't create an otaki, don't put up a wall.
Yeah.
And if you put up a wall, China is without doubt is going to be the number one biggest economy in the world. And therefore, export and import between the two countries is going to be fundamental. And therefore, building up a wall with huge tariff. There was a time he talked about 100% tariff.
Yeah.
The guy was totally out of his mind thinking that he would put up a 100% tariff. Xi Jinping and the rest said, if you do that, we do a tit for tat. We'll also do the same thing. Yeah. And if you do the same thing, then there's no trade between them. It's going to be a collapse.
Yeah, and the US has more to lose anyway.
A lot more to lose. And as a result of that, even digressing a little bit, he announced that he was going to do, the 25% tariff for Canada and Mexico. And just yesterday, Justin Trudeau said he had a good phone call with Donald Trump. And the two of them had come with some delay for now, so that they find a way how to talk. There were some things that there were compromises they were going to make. I don't know what will come out in the next couple of weeks, and to come with compromises with doing
one
this.
of them is Trump saying that he agrees to pause tariffs on Canada.
Tariff. Yeah, that's the thing, you see. So when you start by doing this, you realize the backlash is coming out from there. You must always respect the competition. Back to my point before, if you declare you're going to do something, if you think that the competition will take it lying down, that's part of the problem, actually. In leadership, always respecting the competition, always knowing that they can come back to bite you, is a very important component of leadership. But if you think they're going to lie down, but when they come back fighting at you, then you recoil. Then by the time when you were doing, you lose the upper hand in negotiations and in tactics as well. So I think Donald Trump has to take a leaf from learning to respect the competition a great deal.
To close, let's talk about how do you bounce back? How do you come back from a loss?
Yeah, those are very important measures. The first thing is to acknowledge and accept the loss, not denying it. So if you are in a loss, whether it's to do with personal loss, financial loss, loss in defeat, even loss in an election, to accept and acknowledge the loss is key. And the second thing that is important is having now done this, grieve for absolutely you can grieve, but don't stay stuck in it. And just like Roberta Flack has a song called "We Can Live in This World, but the world should not live within us." So you can live in a world where someone has died, your loved one, you can grieve, but don't get stuck into it. Take action. Move on. So how do you move on? The first thing to do is to return to your definition of true north. Because in a loss, you're going to become derailed. You become confused about what your true north is. You might have to redefine your true north, but that's a starting point. Come back to the drawing board and redefine your true north and put their ambitions, your target, as we've discussed ad nauseum in many of our previous episodes. Then you identify the priorities that will then help you to deal with how to get out from the rut. 6 or 7 priorities. Then you run labs. You get people in a team to really operationalize these 6 or 7 priorities into detailed weekly things that you need to act on. The key here is that action. Action is the thing that gets you out from your loss. So that is the key. Returning the true north, coming with the priorities, working out an operational plan at 3 feet to deal with this, and then you act, you get and implement it. And that's how you get out from it. And if you do that, and sometime you may realize that, well, I don't have enough capacity to do this. I need help. Then call for help. You might need professional help from people who are better at doing it. And if you are running a business, you're struggling with it, you can get some consulting advice. Even friends who are very good at dealing losses, you can get advice from them. But seek help. And even if you are dealing with losses incurred from loss from a loved one, seek professional help for mental difficulties and stress that's going out as a result of it. There are huge losses that people have to deal with, but acknowledging the loss and thinking of what to do. Actually, I don't know, you follow UFC, you know, Adesanya, Israel Adesanya is a Nigerian fighter.
Yep.
This guy, 3 matches in a row he's lost.
Yep.
He lost big fight against Strickland, he lost. And the next loss was Duplessis. This is South African, he lost. Imomov, he lost. Now today, he needs to sit down and ask the question, I have now lost 3 huge matches in a row. Is this the time to retire, to redefine my true north? If it says, I accept, I acknowledge this, I now say I'm not going to bounce back, I decide I'm going to retire, what do he do? Redefine his true north. That's exactly what Tyson did. When Tyson lost, he didn't go back. When he tried to go back, he knew that he's lost it all. What did he do? He reinvented himself. He redefined his entire true north. That guy is very good in talk shows. He makes a lot of money talking, and he makes fun of himself on TikToks, on television. So he completely redefined himself. I think this is the key. When people go back to true north, get back to the drawing board and redefining in yourself, you accept that loss, but you move on to a new chapter.
Yep. Although he did many years down the line, return to the ring.
He went to the ring, but you notice everybody knew he was out there to make money.
It was to make money, and and ultimately, I mean, like, okay, to make money, but also
He
I think
had no
he did it
problem with
to
the
put
loss.
on a show.
Yep.
At the end of the day, it was still
For the show.
It was still exciting and fun to watch.
And the amazing thing was when he came back for that fight, it was incredible at his age to look at how his body had remained really
Still
fit
solid.
and solid. But although he lost, but you could tell very clearly he had already accepted that he could lose it.
Exactly.
But he went for the money and he had no problem. If for the show, he was a showman. He was doing it. So once you redefine your true north, you're comfortable with under your own skin.
The pursuit of trying to avoid losses or whether you have experienced a loss, whether you have bounced back from a loss, what ties all of those things together is that there is work required. And you need to face many trials in that pursuit, in that journey of trying to achieve, impossible things. And so I just want to close with this verse from the Bible, actually, from James 1, verse 2-3, which says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." So the encouragement to all of you who are listening, persevere in the things that you're doing, have tenacity. If things don't work out, try something else. And, I think that also be cognizant of when you maybe get to a point where perhaps you have taken too many losses, and I think know when to stop. So wherever you are on that journey, we just encourage you to keep asking yourself those questions, keep persevering, not necessarily persevering in continuing to do the same thing, even if you're going through a series of losses, but persevering in trying to attain continuous learning. I think whether it's within yourself, whether it is through reflecting, if you're religious, then reflecting in times of prayer, or in a team setting, then speaking with those who are close to you, those whom you trust, those whom you know have your best interest, and being okay with having difficult conversations, because usually it's the difficult conversations that produce good fruit. So thank you all for listening to yet another episode of The Game of Impossible. If you like this conversation, we upload episodes weekly every Friday at 6 a.m. We also have short form content on both our IG as well as TikTok at The Game of Impossible. So do give us a follow, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.